I bought that piece of land straight out of boot camp. 19 years old, fresh off my first deployment bonus, proud to have anything to call my own. It was just under 2 acres, nothing fancy, just a sloped patch of hillside with a view of the valley. My plan was to build a cabin there someday, after I'd done my time, something peaceful. Maybe even raise a family. I paid it off in cash and kept the taxes current. No mortgage, no liens, nothing. But what I didn't know was that when I bought the land, I'd been automatically signed into a homeowners association. Not that there were any homes on it. Hell, there weren't even roads at the time, but apparently the developers had preemptively formed an HOA, and any purchase within the subdivision fell under their jurisdiction. I shrugged it off when I found out. Figured it was bureaucratic fluff and filed it in the deal with it later folder in my head. I'd be deployed most of the next few years anyway. That turned out to be a mistake. Fast forward 6 years. I've just returned from my 3rd overseas tour, bruised, proud, and exhausted. First thing I do after hugging my mom and crashing for 48 hours is start sorting through the stack of mail she'd been keeping for me. Somewhere between a VA appointment letter and a coupon for auto parts was a legal document. Notice of sale. The HOA had declared my land abandoned. They cited unpaid maintenance fees for the unpaved road running past my property and claimed I hadn't responded to any of their notices, because of course I hadn't. I'd been halfway around the world. No phone reception in Kandahar. No one from the HOA had ever called me. No certified mail. Nothing that would have given me a chance to respond. They sold it at auction. $4/$7, $200. To one of their own board members. I paid $36,000 for that land. I saw red. My first thought was to hire a lawyer, but it turns out HOA law is murky, and fighting them is like trying to wrestle fog. I could file suit, but that would take years. Meanwhile, the land was already being cleared. Some developer was planning to build a model home for a new, patriotic community. They called it Valor Heights. The irony was a punch in the teeth. But here's where things get interesting. See, while I'd been deployed, I wasn't just doing basic patrols. I'd spent the last 2 years embedded with a civil engineering unit. I'd worked on rebuilding roads, water lines, even military outposts. I had contacts, and more importantly, I had knowledge of how the Army operated when it came to land use, property rights, and eminent domain. Turns out, the area that Subdivision was built on, including my land, was once part of a military easement granted back in the 1950s during the Cold War. The base nearby had since downsized, but the Army still technically held certain emergency access rights over the terrain, especially for training purposes. And wouldn't you know it, the HOA, in its infinite wisdom, had built a clubhouse right over one of the old emergency egress routes. Now, I wasn't some movie villain plotting revenge. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I wanted justice. And I wanted them to understand the cost of messing with someone who had bled for the dirt they stole. So I made a few calls. I spoke with an old CO who now worked at the local National Guard HQ. Then I contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. I pointed out the outdated easement maps and noted that the terrain was still listed as an available emergency training zone, pending reclassification. I even had a buddy from legal services help me draft a formal request for temporary occupation of the subdivision under military training provisions. The Army's interest was piqued. It had been years since they'd done drills in that area, and they were always looking for realistic environments. A suburban zone with modern buildings and terrain? Perfect. 2 months later, with full notice given under federal law, the Army rolled in with a light training unit. Trucks. Engineers. A few camo tents. No weapons, no live fire. Just logistical drills. But they came in through the old route, right through Valor Heights. I stood at the edge of the subdivision as military vehicles rolled over the curb, tracked tires pressing into pristine HOA-mandated grass. A sergeant barked orders near what used to be the community pool. The Patriots Pavilion clubhouse had its doors taped shut, An orange military seal slapped across the entrance, declaring it a temporary operations hub. The HOA president stormed toward me. I recognized him from the auction paperwork. Gregory Whitman, 50-something, paunchy, with a golf visor and an inflated sense of authority. "You can't do this," he shouted. I showed him the paperwork. Actually, under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, and with the original easement still active, I can. He tried to argue. He called the mayor. He called the sheriff. But none of them could override a federal operation. For 2 weeks, the Army conducted exercises. Just enough to inconvenience. Early morning roll calls. Temporary roadblocks. Engineering drills that accidentally ripped up a newly paved walking path. By the time they packed up, Gregory looked like a man who had aged 10 years. That alone might have satisfied me. But karma had one more gift. The Army's presence triggered a zoning review. Turns out, several of the structures built by the HOA, including the clubhouse, violated local codes. Worse, the HOA had failed to properly record easement overlaps when constructing certain roads, meaning their insurance was now voided. Homeowners began receiving notices. Lawsuits started flying. From residents, from the city, from the developer. One by one, people resigned from the board. Gregory tried to sell the land he'd purchased from me, but a lien from the city halted the sale. Then I made my final move. I filed a lawsuit, not just for wrongful sale, but for fraud, violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and intentional emotional distress. With the easement and military interference now part of public record, and multiple homeowners filing similar complaints, my case didn't just have legs, it had a jetpack. They settled. Quietly. I got my land back. And then some. With the funds, I cleared it, planted native trees, put up a sign that read, "Veteran-owned land. No trespassing. No HOA." The best part? I leased part of the land to the National Guard for an annual training site. Nothing big, just enough to keep the easement active. Every now and then, a convoy rolls through Valor Heights. Trucks rumble. Radios crackle. Gregory moved out last I heard. Sold his house at a loss. I didn't repossess the subdivision out of spite. I did it to remind people that freedom isn't just a word on a flagpole or a buzzword in a real estate brochure. It's something we defend, with our lives, our rights, and when necessary, with a firm reminder that you don't screw with someone who's been trained to fight for every inch of ground they stand on. Some people own land. I earned mine. Thanks for watching this story. You are great. Goodbye.